Hi, it's Ursula from ursula-smith.com, and I am back with yupo paper cutouts. So we're going to talk a little bit about paper today. I've mentioned this a couple of times now. Generally, when I've done this, I've taken a yupo paper cutout and I've either covered it with a paste or used it directly as a mask or a stencil. And I'm usually using with plain, cheap, whatever I can find, cardstock, which is very, very, very absorbent. So I wanted to show you the difference between using plain cardstock with this technique versus the Distress, in this case, the heavyweight. And it's very different the way the Distress inks react. So you'll get slightly different looks. So I'm going to start out with the way that I normally do it. And again, this is just plain cardstock, a yupo paper cutout. I've mentioned this, what I've started to use. I found some zig glue in my craft room, and I started using this to make the back of my yupo paper cutouts tacky. If you put it on and let it dry, it becomes repositionable. So that's what I've been using. And then we are just going to grab a color. First color I grabbed is pickled raspberry. So I'm going to spritz, and actually, let's grab another color too. Second one is scattered straw. So because the Distress ink does not dry on Distress Oxide does not dry on yupo paper, I usually take another piece of paper. Where is my other piece of paper? And I'll mop up that ink that's laying around on that mask. And if I think of it, I will. Sometimes I'll use a scrap piece of paper. Sometimes I forget and get it all over my hands. But you're just going to press the paper down against the yupo paper mask. And what ultimately you'll get is the reverse image on each of the backgrounds. So it's going to take me a minute to peel this off. I have to be very careful. This is very delicate with lots of little pieces. There we go. So, kind of the yin and yang of the design. And then I typically come back in with Distress spray stains. Not sure how well this is going to work. This is shaded lilac, and spritz over the back, and the Distressed Oxide will resist. Let's grab another color. This one is Salty Ocean. Oops, this one's not spraying very well. Okay, let's grab something else, shall we? Stormy Sky. A little bit duller color. And so the Distress Oxide ink resists the regular Distress spray stains. With the cardstock, the plain cardstock, it's very, very porous, so it will suck in that ink, the spray stain, pretty quickly. There are some pools left around, so sometimes I'll go in and kind of mop it with a leftover piece of paper. But then usually, I don't usually take the time to dry it. I just kind of work in a session and I have these all over. drying, so I'm just going to air dry them. And then, you know, if you want, you can spritz and mop. Close enough. And then set that aside too. So I'm going to clean this because I want to show you some other things and I really don't want to get blue ink all over everything. So, actually, so then the next thing we were going to do is let's do the same thing, but this time with the heavyweight, the Distress heavyweight. I'm going to use the smooth side up. And so same thing, we're going to spritz the yupo paper with Distress Oxide spray. And again, we're using pickled raspberry and scattered straw. And then another piece, again, of the same type of cardstock. And try to line it up. And just press it against that yupo paper to get the transfer. So I do this a lot because I kind of get a twofer. And, you know, so the same amount of time I can get 2 pieces out of it. There's actually still some ink left on that, so see if we can get a little more. Maybe not, but let's try. Kind of like the look of that rubbing. Yeah, not quite. A little bit. Okay, I'm going to set that one aside, and then we're going to carefully peel off this mask again. So what I have found is this paper is a little less porous than the regular cardstock. So I don't know if you can see, but the distressed ink is still wet, much wetter than it would be with the regular cardstock. So now if we come back in with the spray stains, I mean, if I wanted, I could go in and dry that, but I'm trying to do this in the same manner that I typically do with the plain cardstock. So I'm going to go in with the spray stains. What did I, oh yeah. I was using that other blue and that sprayer was bad. So you'll see there's less of a resist. Kind of looks like a big fat mess. So what I, again, typically do is I let this sit overnight. And so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this one and do just that. Just so that you can see. I'm looking for something to dry it on. Here we go. That is a big old fat mess. Just so that we can see the results, compared to how I usually work. But in this case, let us take a dryer. So I'm just going to use a heat tool and we're going to dry it. Where was my mopping paper? Ooh. It's actually looking kind of cool. All right, close enough. So, and I will say, I do not keep my heat tools plugged in. I used to teach at a stamping store, and one of the women that I taught with had a, I can't remember if it happened to her, it was a while ago, I can't remember if it happened to her or a friend of hers left their heat tool plugged in, and the cat knocked it over, turned it on, and caused a little fire. So ever since then, I do not keep my heat tools plugged in. So the resist looks like it is starting to come back, but to me, it just does not seem as crisp as, the regular, plain old cardstock. So it's still a cool look. It's just, in my mind, it's not quite as crisp. And it's pretty dry now. So, unplug my tool. And then I'm just going to wipe this up. And then I'll bring over some examples and we can talk about the difference. So that's what it looks like on the matte heavyweight. Again, you can still see the background, but it's not quite as resisty. It's not quite as crisp and clear. So for instance, so here's one example where I did this on the regular cardstock. I don't have the yang to my ying because I gave that part away. But this is the same idea, just a different, more of a shape rather than just an all-over background. But these were the same idea, and I just used different sprays, spray stains. So I used the same Distress ink because then I, pressed the other piece of paper over the yupo paper cutout to get the reverse, but then I just spritzed with different spray stains. And it just seems to me it's much clearer and much more distinct versus this, which again is very pretty. It just is a little softer. So the one thing I will say that I do like about this, if you've ever used, here's a plain piece of cardstock that it's just one of my mopped up pieces of paper. If you ever try to do the, water droplet, lift off anything with water on regular plain cardstock, a lot of times it does not work. So if I spritz with water, I can try and lift off, and you'll get a little bit, but it's not as pronounced. And then probably by the time I dried, you could barely see where I did the water droplets. If you do it right away, you can get a little bit better result. But in general, if you're trying to do that technique, that does not work with the plain cardstock. However, if we're using the Distress medium, and the Distress heavyweight cardstock, the Distress line of cardstocks, that's what it's meant to do, is all the water-based techniques work great on this paper. So if I spritz this with water, and I can go in and hurry it along and do some lift off, and the ink, so it doesn't resist as well, but it lifts off much better. So you could go in, and my sprayer's not behaving lately, but you could go in and do little water droplets. And to me, this look kind of gives the idea of like old wallpaper, you know, that's sat around in a house and had water damage. And you could go back in with more ink if you wanted. You could bring an ink pad in there. And again, on the Distress cardstock, you could just do that ad nauseum. With the regular cardstock, pretty much it's almost like a one-shot deal. I mean, you could add, but the removing, it does not work as well. So that's kind of the difference. It kind of depends on what you're going for. If you want to play all day with a single piece of cardstock, you're better off using the Distress cardstock because that's what it's made for. If you kind of want a one and done, the thin cardstock is perfect for that. So, so let's take a look. Here is another example. This was a yin and yang. And again, you can see the background, it's the same, basically the same one as this. The stencil I used today, or mask I used today, is slightly different. But same, this is the same pattern as this, and you can see the difference. Thin cardstock, Distress media, or Distress heavyweight. So you can see there's a background, but it's very soft, kind of flowed out a little bit. But then if you want the water droplet look, which again, I think this kind of looks like old wallpaper, it works much better to do it that way. On this, you can see, and here, you can see drops. That is not made with water. That's made with additional Distress Oxide ink just kind of spritzed on. And then it will react. If you spritz it with either a spray stain or water, it will react that as when it's wet. Only when it's wet on the thin cardstock. I can't go in now and spritz it and have it do the same thing. It may change color, but it won't lift off as easily as on the heavyweight. So hopefully that makes sense. So then I did want to mention, usually I'm trying to do a take 5, which is, you know, do something, be finished in under 5 minutes. So, you know, yupo paper, a couple of spritzes, one and done. But sometimes you want to play around a little bit. And so I did want to show you this idea. So this was, I have another piece of a stencil. So what I did here was I used the yupo paper cutout. So this actually was just, so I don't know, came out of the middle of that. Oh, there it goes. So it came out of the middle of this. So I spritzed this first with a darker Distress Oxide, and then I kind of used it almost like a stamp. So you see sort of, kind of, the background, but it's very watercolory looking, which is kind of what I was going for. Then what I did was I took this piece, spritzed it with greens on the bottom, reds and pinks on the top, and then the same thing, kind of printed it, you know, on the cardstock. And again, this is the matte heavyweight, and I'm printing on the smooth side. So that was my stamp, and it was a little crisper when I stamped with it first. But then I came back in with the spray stains, and I spritzed it with 2 different color yellows. And immediately, and I didn't really dry it, at least right away. And it just started to wick out and flow and spread and kind of become this amorphous background. However, I liked that with the idea of going back in with the actual cutout to overlay the kind of watercolory looked background. So just another way of using yupo paper cutouts. And I might even use it this way, that you can see the yupo paper kind of, the Distress Oxides kind of stained the yupo paper. So it's a softer look, but it's light enough that it kind of stands off the background. So I might just glue it and be done with it. So still probably close to a take 5. So anyway, that's just a different idea of using the yupo paper cutouts. The other thing I did want to mention is, I know I talked about this in another video, you can color yupo paper cutouts with alcohol ink. My whole reason for starting this whole series was I didn't want to always have to use alcohol ink. But this is an example of coloring a yupo paper cutout on yupo paper with alcohol inks. So again, I get a twofer out of it, but I didn't need the coating. Alcohol ink works perfectly fine. The other thing you could do, and this was part of the original series, was going through a stencil with paste, and then, using the leftover, or using the paste on the yupo paper cutout. Sorry about that. Using the paste on the yupo paper cutout to then go back in and color, but then using the leftover on the background as well. And so with this one, when the paste was still wet, I coated it with embossing glaze, which is just a translucent, comes in colors, embossing powder. So it's translucent, so you could see through to whatever is underneath. I had started with a pre-colored background, and so when I did that on the colored background, whatever was there showed through, and then I went back in with Distress Oxide and glaze or regular spray stains and water and kind of muted out the background. But the spray stains and oxides don't stick to the embossing glaze, so you can just wipe it off. So that's another way of using that technique where we coat the yupo paper on a background with whatever paste we're using, but then instead of just leaving the paste plain, you can toss embossing glaze over it. So that was one other thing. And then I know we've talked about this before. Micaceous iron oxide is one of my favorite golden paints, and we've done this with embossing folders. We've coated just a plain piece of cardstock, run it through an embossing folder, and then use Distress Oxide ink pads to color it, because it colors it beautifully. However, the same technique where we used a yupo paper cutout and used either collage medium or crackle or whatever paste or gel we were using, instead of using just a plain art medium, you could use paint. And in my case, I love iron oxide. And so again, you're left with a twofer. And then because it's micaceous iron oxide, you could come in with Distress Oxide ink and color it. So that's a whole bunch of different tips, quick and fast. Hope you liked them. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time. Okay, so I am back, and my Distress Resist prints have dried. So this was the regular cardstock. So you can see the resist is a little more defined. And then I always forget which is the reverse, which was the original and which was the inverse, where I go against the mask. But these are both the plain cardstock, again, sprayed over a yupo paper mask with Distress Oxides, and then I use the regular spray stain, and it resists, and it does it pretty, the detail is a lot tighter because the paper is much more porous and everything sinks in right away. So then I did the same technique on the Distress Heavyweight cardstock. And as I explained, if you want to be able to lift up the Distress color with water, in this case, I literally just spritzed it with a couple of drops of water and used a paper towel to kind of lift it up. It works much better on the Distress Heavyweight. But the Resist is a little softer. I still think it's pretty. Like I was saying earlier, it kind of reminds me of almost like an old wallpaper or something like that. Makes a great background. So say, if I had a cutout, it's a little less detailed, a little softer. So it works better for a background for another yupo paper cutout. And then this was the other one so this one I dried with the heat tool and then fiddled with the water spots. And then this one I just let air dry like I normally do. And, you can still see the pattern, but again, it's just a little bit softer than on the cardstock. And a little bit different colors, even though I use the same ones. So interesting. They're both great. I use them both. But I did want to point out, because generally when I show, I use the regular cardstock, not so much the heavyweight, but it is, you could do the same thing. It just looks a little bit different. So thanks for joining me. See you next time.